This is Kathryn MacDonald, and this is session 5 in our interpersonal, or in our Supporting Indigenous Youth program. And the 5th webinar focuses on interpersonal effectiveness and walking the middle path. So this is me, and we are really focusing on dialectical behavior therapy coping skills. So skills that have been developed from the dialectical behavior therapy programs from Marshall and Ahan. And the goals of all of this have been to see if we can provide distressed youth with some skills to manage their emotion, help them decrease impulsive self-harm, decrease reliance on substances to manage emotion, and to increase healthy life skills and habits. So in the previous 4 sessions, we focused on the DBT Skills Manual strategies by Raffis and Miller. And again, I just encourage any of you who are working with youth to consider getting this book because it's very useful. And we started with mindfulness and then looked at emotional regulation and distress tolerance. And today we're going to look at the last 2 areas of walking the middle path and interpersonal effectiveness, actually starting with the interpersonal effectiveness area. So in session 4, we looked at basic DBT skills, and we reviewed a little bit of the mindfulness and the stuff that we've done in session 3 on distress tolerance and emotion regulation. And we focused on the importance of helping clients understand and recognize emotions, and decreasing unwanted emotions and emotional suffering. And we looked at the struggles that people have in tolerating emotion and the labeling of emotions as positive and negative, and helping people accept emotion as they are as opposed to trying to label them one way or another. We also looked at the fact that sensitivity to emotion and the intensity of emotion experienced by youth can be leading them to behaviors that then cause them problems. So if they're having outbursts that are interfering with their relationships, or if they are using substances to control their emotions because they feel overwhelmed by them. And we also looked at the fact that differentiating between emotions can be really difficult for some people, and we looked at some ways to start to explore that. And then we looked at a model of emotions, connecting vulnerabilities and triggers and emotional reactions to behaviors and consequences. And we looked at the importance of differentiating urges from actions, because you can have the urge to hit someone when you're angry, but that doesn't mean that you've done it. So there's a very big difference between having the urge to do something and actually engaging in the behavior. And then we looked at strategies and exercises for helping youth learn to manage emotion. There was an approach called ABC Please that we looked at from the book, which really focuses on increasing positive emotions and reducing vulnerability, but really with the goal of creating a more balanced lifestyle. And so the A is really about accumulating positive experiences, B is building mastery, C is planning ahead and coping ahead with difficult emotional situations, and then treating physical illness, balanced eating, avoiding mood-altering drugs, balanced sleep, and getting exercise as being the please part of that acronym. And the importance really of having a healthy life in order to feel well. So in terms of short and long-term strategies for accumulating positive experiences, we looked at various ways of managing physical health, looking at problem solving, looking at the WAVE skill for managing uncomfortable emotions. And then we looked at the opposite action to change emotion. So when people feel something and they have an urge for action, learning to do the opposite action in order to change the way they feel and to tolerate the emotion better. So for every emotion, there tends to be an urge, and for every urge, there's an opposing urge that you can use to help you not do the thing that might be problematic for you. So today we're going to start with focusing on interpersonal effectiveness, and this is really about managing relationships. So interpersonal effectiveness focuses on skills to establish and maintain positive relationships. And I'm totally aware that for a lot of the youth that you see, they don't have a lot of positive relationships, and that there may be some time that needs to be spent actually looking at the relationships that are important in the youth's life and helping them to determine which relationships are healthy and positive and which ones can be really developed in a healthy way. So we know that healthy relationships are the basis of a stable and a healthy life, and it's very hard to manage distress if you don't have people to lean on and people that you feel connected to. So your good social supports are really important for helping you to tolerate difficult situations, and that's where I think a lot of the youth that we see, whether it's youth in the North or youth here who have, similar difficulties with living situations and family issues, they don't have a lot of those good social supports. And some of the social supports that they develop are supports that are not helping them in a positive way. So, for example, friends might be people that they can drink with or do drugs with, and so they feel better when they're with them, but the actual coping strategies are not helpful for them in the long run. So developing good and healthy social supports and relationships are big building blocks of resiliency, and resiliency is really something that we are aiming for with all the youth that we treat and know. So another skill that's looked at in the area of interpersonal effectiveness is assertiveness, and it's a skill that's essential to everyday life, but that many, many people aren't good with. So assertiveness is really about being able to get the things that you want or need in an appropriate way without being aggressive, but with actually standing up for yourself and making it clear that those are needs that you have. And assertiveness is also about being able to say no to people and not give them what they need while still maintaining a healthy relationship with that person if it's appropriate. So helping youth to feel positive about themselves and feel that they can stand up for themselves in this way is a really important part of letting them feel that sense of mastery and independence that we talked about in the very first session as being important in that sense of well-being. You probably know from your own lives that when you say no to someone in an aggressive way, or when you say no to someone and it has a negative impact on the relationship, or if you end up saying yes to someone when you really want to say no, it can be very damaging to the way you feel about yourself, but also to the way you feel about the other person. So Miller and Rathis look at the various things that get in the way of healthy relationships. And these are true, I think, for all of us. One of the major things that gets in the way of relationships is not knowing what to do or say. Now, this can be because of shyness. It can be because of issues in the relationship or in the friendship. It can be because of not knowing how to express what you want to say, or feeling that the other person isn't hearing it, and really about wanting to be able to communicate and be validated in a healthy way. Another thing that gets in the way of healthy relationships is when people have a fear of doing or saying the wrong thing, or where they have doubts about themselves in the relationship and worry that if there's a tension in the relationship that they are the problem, and not being able to communicate about that. A third thing is not having good control of emotions, so being emotionally overexpressive. Usually that's more of a problem with things like anger and distress, because when people are faced with extremely high emotion, it can feel quite threatening to them. And so sometimes they will back away from someone who doesn't have good control of their emotions. Another thing that gets in the way in relationships is not knowing what you want from a relationship and not knowing where you stand in a relationship, which can be very detrimental. And again, the answer to all of this tends to be communication and being able to talk about those things with the person that you're in a relationship with. External issues like pressure from other people can get in the way of healthy interpersonal experiences, and so can feeling like you're in a no-win situation. So if you feel that whatever you do is going to end up being negative for you, that tends to evoke a lot of negative responses from people. The same thing can happen if you put other people into a position where they're in a no-win situation. So there are three basic skills that Miller and Rathis and Linehan use for interpersonal effectiveness, and they really focus on these skills. So the first is give, which is really for remembering how to develop good relationships. And the four fundamental parts of that are being gentle with people, so being a kind and respectful person, and showing that gentleness to the other person. This can be hard for a lot of people, particularly if they've never been treated that way themselves. They may not actually know how to be gentle with others. The I in give is for interested, so showing interest in another person's views and ideas, even if you don't agree with them or like them, will show the person that you're listening and that you're interested in caring what they have to say. The V is for validate, so show them that you hear what they say. So this might be by agreeing with them or asking them about it, or by paraphrasing what they've said and say, so you're saying this, can you help me to understand if I've got that right? Or can you explain that to me again, so that they know that you're listening and that you're interested. And the E in give is for an easy manner, so trying to be pleasant and open with people, not giving people attitude right away. And this is one that a lot of teenagers struggle with because they tend to come into relationships or come into situations with another person with an attitude, and then the other person shuts them off right away. So showing them that, in fact, they don't need to have that attitude in order to have good communication can be important. Teenagers often equate attitude with strength, and they need to learn that, in fact, being calmer and more open can actually be a greater strength than that attitude. So in the book, there's an exercise, a practice exercise to look at a specific situation using those give skills. And this is something that even if you don't think the youth has the interest or ability to write the exercise out somewhere else, you could work through this in the setting that you're in. And you can write those answers out for them. The Dear Man exercise, again, these are all acronyms to help people remember the skills, but the Dear Man is really about assertiveness and how to be assertive and get the things that you want or need. So the D is for describing the situation. And it's really important in describing the situation that you stick to the facts. So things that are kind of incontrovertible truths, so things that are to be the case, not opinions and not ideas, but facts. The E is for expressing your feelings. And so not talking about how the other person feels or things that the other person has done, but explaining your experience of it. A is ask for what you want to happen. So being able to go into a situation and explain to the other person what it is that you're wanting to get out of the exchange. So when you, for example, when you did this to me, or when this happened, this is how I experienced it, and I would really like it for that to not happen again, rather than when you did this to me. So that is a difficult thing for a lot of people to get their minds around. The R is for reward them ahead by describing a positive effect. So basically what you want to be doing is rewarding the other person by explaining to them what's going to be in it for them if things change. And so talking about the different approaches and how you can both benefit is important. The N is for having a mindful focus on what you want and why. So being clear in your own mind about what it is that you need and why you need it, so that you can explain it clearly to the other person. A is for appearing confident, and again, confident but not aggressive. So it's not about attitude, it's about feeling that they're standing up for themselves and using an appropriate tone and voice and posture, not threatening, but strong and calm. And N is for negotiating. So being able to give up some things in order to get more from the other person. So, you know, I would really like this, and I know that you would prefer this, so I'm going to give you this if you'll let me do it this way. So being able to give up something that you have that the other person might have an interest in. So again, Dear Man is really just a way of remembering those describe, express, ask, reward, mindful, appear, and negotiate words that will remind people about how to be assertive in those situations. Anytime that you can use an example when you're working with the kids is really helpful, because a lot of the time they struggle in their own lives and they can't necessarily think of examples off the bat. But if they come in with a particular situation where it would be appropriate, you can work through that situation. But otherwise, you can also have examples from your own life or examples that you can make up that will help them see how the approach works. And again, if you do get the book, there are handouts that you can use to help people work out. Sometimes writing things down helps people to remember things, but it really depends on how good the person's abilities are in terms of reading and writing and whether they have any interest in carrying these around. Certainly what we know in terms of the evidence base for this approach is that doing the exercises helps. But if you can do them verbally, sometimes that can be just as effective. And if you can find another way of helping them to remember the strategies, then that would be equally important. The last example in this area is FAST. So the acronym FAST, which is for fairness. And fairness is something that in interpersonal relationships always gets you further. And it's good to be fair to yourself as well as to other people, because if you're always fair with others but not with yourself, you end up building up resentment. A is for apologize, and knowing when to apologize and when not to apologize, because sometimes we find that we are apologizing all the time and it's not always our fault. S in FAST is for sticking to what you believe in and want. So really doing this in a mindful way, though, is important. And looking at why is it that you want it, and is this an impulsive desire, or is this something that is truly a need in your life? T is for truth, and the importance of sticking to truth and not lying or exaggerating or making excuses for things. Because as soon as you start lying and exaggerating and making excuses, you lose the respect of the other person in the relationship, and they're less likely to take you seriously and listen to you. Again, any time in these exercises where you can find an example from the youth's own life, that can be most effective. But if there isn't an example from that person's life, you can use one from your own or an example from a book or a story or a movie that that youth might be familiar with, so that they can see how these exercises work in real life. And again, that's just an example of the practice exercise if you're interested in doing it on a written basis. Just in terms of keeping notes for yourself, for the health record, though, this can be a useful exercise to do the writing, because then when the youth comes back and you have to talk about it again, you can go back to the same example and find out how things went. Other ways in terms of approaching interpersonal effectiveness is to really use examples from inside the relationship you have with that youth if you have seen them before. So, for example, sometimes if they come in and they're showing you attitude, you can talk to them in an assertive way about how that makes you feel and look at alternative ways that they could approach it. And one of the things that works really well with youth is treating them like grown-ups, treating them as equals, because a lot of the time they haven't had a lot of experience being treated that way by adults. And they respond extraordinarily well if they feel that you're taking them seriously and you are treating them with respect. And so that's somewhere where you can actually use the relationship that you're in to give them an example of the benefits. The other thing is to bring them back to that idea of facts versus emotion versus wise mind, and use the idea of wise mind to show why that tends to work best in those relationships. The other thing that's really important for youth is helping them understand that sometimes things don't work out, and they have to be able to accept that things sometimes just don't work out. It doesn't mean that it won't ever work out, and it doesn't mean that nothing's ever going to work out. But sometimes there is a point where you have to accept that you aren't going to get things going your way. And youth can often find this extremely difficult. One of the aspects of assertiveness that can be really important and necessary when they're asking for things from other people would be to look at what it is that they're asking for or what it is that they're trying to say no to, and look at all the different factors that need to be considered, both from their perspective and from the other person's perspective. So the thing that they want or the thing that they don't want, is it really important? And is now the best time for them to have it or for them to ask for it? And what are the pros and cons, the consequences of both success and failure? So if they get what they want, what are the benefits, short-term and long-term? And if they don't get, what are the consequences, short-term and long-term, if they don't get what they want? The other thing is to really look at is what they're trying to do or what they're asking for possible and realistic. Sometimes I get youth coming in and asking me, for example, for medication. And this is a strategy that I can use with them. So is this the right time? What's my thinking? I try and be very open about my thinking about the risks and the benefits to them and why I think right now might or might not be a good time for medication, for example. The other thing is trying to work with youth to see whether they have all the facts that might be having an impact on the decision. And that can be really important because sometimes what they really want is very clear to them, but what they might not know is that there's something else on the part of the other person that might be really important and pertain to whether or not the other person is able or willing to give them what they want. And so helping them to look at things from both points of view. You might not know what is happening with the other person if if the youth is struggling talking to you about a situation, but you might be able to look at from an adult perspective and say, well, what could the other side be? And explaining to them all the time that you don't actually know the details, but these might be the things that you would wonder about if you were in that situation. And again, all the facts would just be the what is it that they want, why do they want it, when do they want it, how do they expect to get it, and looking at all of those things in detail. So they call the think skills. So think about it from the other person's perspective, have empathy, what might that person be thinking or feeling, how can those things be interpreted from different angles, what is it that the other person has been trying to do, has the other person been trying to change things, do you know that they care about what's going on, how are they dealing with their own stress and issues, so what do you notice about the other person? And then when they are approaching the other person, to do it gently and kindly, and again, that's the give skills. So what are the important things to remember in an interaction with somebody else, and trying to work at seeing the other person's perspective. And these are just ways that you can write that down. So the second part that we're going to talk about today is the idea of walking the middle path. And walking the middle path brings us back to the concept of dialectics and the idea that there can be two opposing views and more than one of them can be correct. So the basis of this set of skills really came from Miller and Rathis trying to build a module to help youth and parents work through things. So I'm not going to go into all the parent issues or the parent approaches because it seemed that that might be less likely to be what would be coming into the nursing stations. But I did want to focus on some of the factors that I thought would probably be more important and most important with the youth themselves. That being said, I think that any of these skills and any of these approaches can be used with youth and family members if those are the people with whom they're struggling. And that taking the same approach and just using your own judgment to talk about how to manage it with the other person in the family can be helpful. So again, bringing back the concept of dialectics, the idea was that adolescents often end up butting heads with the adults in their lives because they hold very strongly to one side of an argument, and when they do that, the response of the adults is often to hold fast to the opposite side. And so helping the adolescents learn, and the adults, if the adults are involved and there for you to work with, helping them to bring the two sides of the argument closer together and let down some of the barriers that get in the way of them getting along can be really important. So the whole idea of walking the middle path focuses on adults taking a role of clear goals and expectations or rules and expectations and follow through on their part of the relationship, and helping adolescents to accept and follow through with their half of that relationship. So a lot of this really depends on family and caregiver situations, but again, the skills can be beneficial for anybody. So it's about, again, balancing acceptance and change, and the idea of that dialectics, and you can be accepting of who you are but still want to change things to move forward. So the important concepts in this is that every situation can be seen from more than one angle, and this is one that teenagers often really have a difficult time with. And if it comes down to that, a lot of adults really have a hard time with it. So people will stick to their own view of things and not really look at the other person's perspective. And so things tend not to get resolved because people are arguing from fixed positions. And things tend to only get resolved when you start to talk about and communicate and become less fixed in those positions. So in order to not hold on rigidly to ideas that are on opposite sides of something, it's important to look at those other people's positions so that you can find ways where there is some commonality and you can start to work with those things that you do agree on or can tolerate in the other person's argument so that you can solve the problem. It's important to help teenagers understand that just because they acknowledge the other person's viewpoint does not mean that they're necessarily agreeing with them, and that doesn't mean that they're giving in. It just means that they're looking at what's valid about the other person's argument and how it is that the other person is taking that standpoint. So acceptance of the situation and desire for change can both happen, and that is what's meant by walking the middle path. The benefits of walking the middle path are many. So first of all, there's huge benefit in increasing your ways of viewing situations. And anything that allows you to learn different ways of looking at situations and other ways of thinking increases your ability to look at situations and increases your problem-solving capacity. Anytime you're able to truly sit and look at another person's perspective helps you to work through conflicts and differences of opinion and tends to get you out of those headbutting contests, because those headbutting contests happen when two people have different views, opposing views, and just keep saying their own views over and over and over again to the other person. And so nothing ever gets resolved. And so if you can start to share each other's viewpoints, I don't mean share as in take on each other's viewpoints, but accept and look at things from the other person's viewpoint. Sometimes the answer really does lie somewhere in between. Sometimes one person is actually right, and you can see that if you take the other viewpoint. So trying to help them find examples in their lives where they have sometimes been wrong or where they've been able to compromise can be really important and helpful. The other thing about walking the middle path is that it encourages developing more flexible and adaptable coping strategies. And one of the things that we know is that it's not the biggest and the strongest people who survive. It's the people who are most adaptable to situations and the people who are most able to work with what's in front of them rather than what they have always had. And so that tends to result in greater success and better relationships. And there are many examples in nature, for example, where it's really the most adaptable organism that survives. And I think it's very much the same with people. So trying to find the ways to adapt to situations, and again, in relationships, often that's about compromise. So some of the strategies are about avoiding things like black and white thinking. So black and white thinking is something, if you were there when I did the cognitive behavioral therapy course in Cornwall, that was one of the cognitive distortions that we talked about. And it's a very, very, very common cognitive distortion. So anytime that you're using words like always and never, or accusatory and blaming words, those tend to be situations where you may be engaging in black and white thinking, because it's actually very rare in life for anything to be always one way or never another way. So moving into being able to accept other angles and look at things from other angles and accept those shades of gray is always beneficial. The other thing that's important is learning to accept that nobody actually has the perfect view or the perfect opinion. And it's very, very rare that someone is absolutely right and that there's no wiggle room in their argument. So being able to be open to hearing the views and opinions of other people is what allows for ideas to grow and to change in a healthy way. Because even though you might have a really good idea, somebody else coming along that has a slightly different idea may be able to add to your idea, and together you can take it that much further. This is certainly true in many jobs that are creative, for example. So programming, we see this a lot. Computer programming, someone will develop something and then another programmer will have an idea to make it more efficient or to make it do something else, and in addition to the original plan. And so things like that can be really important. The same with music, for example, is if you have people who play music together and one person might have one way that they play or sing a tune, but another person does it slightly differently. And sometimes you can actually combine those ideas and create something very new and different and beautiful. So those are just some examples that you might be able to give to people to help them see the benefits of not just sticking to one point of view. The other thing that's really helpful in this way, in looking at other people's points of view, is actually asking for clarification. So sometimes we assume we know what the other person is saying, and it turns out that we're actually wrong, and they're not as wrong as we thought they were. And so if we ask for clarification and ask them to explain their ideas and we explain our ideas more clearly, then often there's much more room for compromise and bringing those ideas closer together. This is just a list of all of different cognitive distortions. So this is that's what I've called it in the cognitive behavioral therapy session that I did. They call them thinking mistakes. It's the same thing. But for any of you, you all have access, I think, to the cognitive behavioral therapy manual and to the information that I handed out in Cornwall. And there's a whole list of these cognitive distortions there. So I'm not going to go through them all today, but enough to say that all or nothing thinking or black and white thinking, those are the same thing. The catastrophizing, mind reading, overgeneralization, the mental filters, counting the positive, emotional reasoning, all of these things are distortions in our thinking that interfere with both our relationships and our own ability to move forward. And it affects the way we see things and makes it hard for us to change. And so when we start to recognize those distortions and look at our thinking in a different way, it often will change the way we feel quite dramatically. And changing the way we feel then also tends to have an impact on the way we behave. So here again, just some other exercises that you can look at as you're working through something with youth, ways of just keeping track of what were they thinking, what were the problems. And again, the main reason for this is so that if you can come back to it later on, either because they've come in with another example or because you're trying to help them see the benefits to them in making changes, then it's helpful for you to have the information from specific examples that they've given. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the idea of validation. And they use validation as part of that walking the middle path. And the importance of validation of other people as well as of yourself. And the consequences when people feel invalidated. So the idea of validation is that if you validate what someone is saying, even if validating doesn't necessarily mean that you agree, just that you're hearing them. So validation makes people feel heard, and it can decrease the negative emotions in a situation. When people feel heard, they tend to communicate better. They tend to be more willing to share their ideas, and that means that their communication is more effective and leads to better discussion between you. And so if you can get into a conversation with someone, even if you disagree with them, but say, I hear what you're saying, and validate that you're listening and that you understand that it's their point of view and that you're hearing their point of view, then that can go a long way to improving communication. We use this all the time when we're working with youth, because it's very important for youth to feel validated when they're talking to us as professionals. And so even when we don't necessarily agree with what they're saying, we can say, so it sounds as though this was really difficult for you, or it sounds as though this made you really angry, or help me to understand how you felt in this. And all of that is validating the fact that they had an experience, whether it was a good experience or a bad experience, and that we are understanding what they went through. When people feel invalidated, they will often go into sort of fight or flight mode. So they'll either withdraw completely or they'll get angry and sometimes then walk out. And they tend to feel invalidated if we cut them off, or if we tell them that what they were experiencing was not true, or I've even heard people say, you know, well, that's ridiculous, that's not the way it is. Well, that may be evident to you, but it's not evident to the person who was experiencing that way. So being able to say, it sounds as though you felt really upset by what she said, doesn't say that she actually said it, doesn't say anything about what they said. It just validates their experience in that situation. Validation also helps relationships. So it shows that you're listening, it shows that you're understanding. Again, there's a real importance in showing that you're listening and not judging. And that can be a huge piece of building a relationship, is helping people not to feel judged. And again, I would say that these are skills that are important for us to be using with youth, as well as us teaching the youth to use with other people. It supports the idea, so validation supports the idea that people can disagree, but still care about each other and not have conflict after the fact. So you don't have to agree about everything. You can disagree and still be friends. You can disagree and still be close family members. You can disagree and still have a professional relationship. And sometimes one of the most helpful things you can do is to give youth examples of times where you felt validated or invalidated, and use those personal experiences, obviously not tremendously personal experiences, but we've all had experiences that are not overly private that we could share to illustrate those ideas. Ways of validating others' perspectives are things like active listening. So being engaged, if it feels appropriate, making eye contact, using gestures, responding. They can be verbal cues saying that you're listening, like going, having a clear focus and making it clear that you're focused on that person, asking for clarification because that shows that you're listening, and then commenting on their experience. Those are all forms of validation. The other thing is about watching body language. So again, we should be watching this with the youth and also teaching the youth to watch it as they're using with other people. But sitting hunched with your arms crossed versus having a more open stance, those can make a difference into how well people feel that you're listening to them. And how are you showing your own feelings? So what's the expression on your face, and do you look interested, do you look angry? So being aware of those things, and that's all part, again, of mindfulness, being aware of your own responses and how those things might be showing themselves to others. And imagine how it might feel to be the other person, even if you don't agree. So putting yourself in that other person's shoes can be a really important part of validation. The other thing, and this is something that a lot of our youth have not experienced, is if they haven't had a lot of experience of other people being validating with them, it may be really important for them to learn from you how to validate themselves. So how to listen to their own words, how to use that mindful focus on their thoughts and feelings and behavior to feel confident that they are making an appropriate decision. So not an impulsive one, but one that's being thought through and that's taken the facts and the feelings into account and is making a choice based on wise mind. Commenting on their own feelings or our own feelings to keep us aware reminds us that feelings are okay. We can be angry, we can be sad, we can be happy. Feelings are not right or wrong, they just are. But what we do with those feelings and how we act on those feelings is what can cause problems or create positive situations. The other thing is helping people to understand that they don't have to judge themselves for the way they feel. It's okay for them to be angry, and it's okay for them to be sad, and looking at why it makes sense that they might feel that way. Why is it that this situation makes you angry? Maybe you've been in a situation before where somebody treated you like that and there was a bad outcome. So if you're worried that someone's going to treat you the same way, you're going to become angry or become sad. And so letting them know that it's okay to have those feelings, but it's still important to look at each individual situation and explore it based on facts as well as the way you're feeling so that you're making the right choices. Again, just another practice exercise, so ways of validation, and this comes from the book. So we reviewed both, in the session today, reviewed both interpersonal effectiveness and walking the middle path, as well as some review from last time. My suggestion to you as clinicians is that you try and have some examples that you can use with kids to illustrate some of these ideas. So if you're making notes for yourself on some of these, just jot down some situations. They don't have to be things that really happened. They can be things that you have seen happen to other people, or things that where something similar has happened and you can dress it up in a way that would be applicable or accessible to youth in terms of understanding. And try and pick up examples either from their own lives or things that you've seen happen that are relevant to their lives. So I'm thinking about things like problems that happen in relationships. And those are so difficult for adolescents because they have such intense feelings about relationships and often don't have the experience to know that things happen in relationships and you can get over them. And so those can be really important things that are relevant to their lives. The same with interactions with parents or adults that are important to them, that you can have a fight with someone who cares about you and that doesn't have to end badly, although always keeping in mind that many kids have had traumatic experiences where things have ended badly, and so trying to look at the nature of those relationships without assuming too much. So that's session 5. The next session is the last teaching session, and we'll review some of the basic concepts and how you can use them in practice. And we'll also talk about how to help youth integrate them into day-to-day life